Now, what then would you say then about these kind of the scholars that maybe are appealed to that Jesus wasn't even real? You hear this online. Relevant? I mean, I posted the video online where even Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, the non-Christian guy, he says that he doesn't know anyone with any relevant degree at any major university who believes Jesus didn't exist. It's normally just kind of the internet person. Is there any credibility to that whatsoever?
Well, first of all, it's Bart Ehrman, but what I mean is he's got no reason to want to say that if he doesn't think it's true.
Yeah.
But Bart Ehrman does say, to make one caveat here, Bart Ehrman says, as far as I know, there's only two guys who have terminal degree credentials, Bob Price and Richard Carrier. They're the only ones. But here's the way he says it. There are two out of all the guys who run their mouths and say that. And I say run their mouths because 99 point something percent are not scholars, according to Bart Ehrman's definition. But there's two. But then Bart Ehrman says none of them who hold this position hold teaching positions in accredited universities, colleges, or seminaries. So neither Bob nor Richard, according to Bart Ehrman, hold, a position in one of those accredited schools.
Yeah.
So when these guys keep saying, I'm a scholar, I'm a scholar, I'm a scholar, well, what's their backup? Because they read something? Because they go off on something? Because they can blow up at you? I mean, what makes them a player in this game? And well, anyway, I was just going to say, why are they angry all the time, too? It seems to me there's a lot of emotions going on here in the background. And not everybody, I'm not saying all these folks are angry. Good number of Christians are angry, too. But I have a debate on the resurrection where I'm not one of the participants. And the atheist in the debate specifically says, I'm not one of those angry atheists that you run into all the time. And it's the atheist who makes the comment.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so then what would you say in response? Do you have a short, because one of your areas of study is not only the resurrection, but also the historical Jesus. Do we have, what would be the one or two things you would say that, this is overwhelming reason to believe Jesus, as described maybe in Scripture, at least to some extent, is a real historical person?
Well, I've got a book, Historical Jesus, where I give approximately, actually, about exactly a dozen and a half sources for Jesus outside the New Testament that tell us a lot about Jesus' life. None of the sources, in fact, well over one and a half dozen, not a single source is canonical.
Okay.
But, if you say this to a Bart Ehrman or something, they will let you use all the canonical sources you want, as long as there's backup for any of the text you want. If I talk to the biggest name critics, Bart Ehrman, Don Crossan, if I talk to those guys and I use one of the 7 accredited Pauline epistles, that's the books that they say Paul definitely wrote, they may not agree with Paul, and they don't take his view of Scripture, but they think he's a real scholar, basically a PhD in Old Testament. He's authoritative. He knew the apostles, and he was being honest. He's not lying. So they would cite Paul. Another argument I think is very, very important is about Paul going to Jerusalem. Bart Ehrman says that, right after his conversion, Bart Ehrman says that most of the creedal, maybe all the creedal sources in Paul's epistles could have been in existence from Jerusalem before Paul met the Lord. Bart doesn't believe he met the Lord, but he thinks Paul thought he met the Lord on the way to Damascus. He says all those creeds could have been around at plus 5 years after the cross.
Yeah.
So I think those things, independent evidences, and that Paul went to the horse's mouth. Bart Ehrman himself says this is as close as we come to eyewitnesses, and that is Paul giving us the testimony of Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and then in chapter 2, he goes back to Jerusalem of Galatians, and John is there. They're the big 4.
Okay.
Paul, John, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus.
Awesome. That is so good to know. So then as we kind of, one thing I love to do, and I have short answer Q&A videos, question of the day on my channel, is give people short responses to, challenges or questions that they may get. And so kind of going through some of the objections maybe to the resurrection, what would you say to someone who says that, it was normal for them? Jesus was not a rich person. He was just the common kind of man, and they would have just thrown him in a mass grave. He would have never gotten a proper burial. So his body was probably just thrown in a mass grave, and then we lost him. And that's why they thought the tomb was empty.
Okay, a number of problems. First of all, he was crucified in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem is exactly the location where the private tombs are. Jesus had some well-to-do friends. We're told that two of them were Joseph and Nicodemus. They came forward according to the text, and someone could say, oh, you're quoting the Bible to me now. Okay, fine. Remember I said a moment ago, independent texts, and Paul went to the eyewitnesses. On the independent score, all four Gospels say that Jesus was buried in an individual tomb. You can disagree with it. Now, scholars, they think, well, Matthew took this from Mark, Luke from Mark, John. That's two sources, Mark and John. But scholars believe that there's 3, 4, or even 5 sources for some of these things, because it's also recorded in an early creed in Acts 13. You also get Paul's quoting the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, died, buried, rose. For a Jewish thinker, especially a Pharisee, as Paul was, to be buried and to go down and to come back out again means that what went down is what came out. So Paul, I think, implies the empty tomb. By the way, it's Paul who's speaking in Acts 13 that said Jesus was buried in a tomb. So we have independent evidences, I think. And by the way, all right, so you reject the empty tomb. Someone rejects it. Good. It's not even one of my 6 facts. So you're going to have to go after the other data and go after the appearances. That's the big one. You got to disprove the appearances. That's the hardest job.
Okay. Now, so one time, and I've shared this story a long time ago, but I wanting to be able to use apologetics and tell people about Jesus and all this kind of stuff, and just the opportunities weren't coming. And it was right after I finished my graduate class at Biola on the evidence for the resurrection that I was on a plane flying back home for the summer, and a guy sits down next to me and brings up how we can't know if anyone's ever died and risen from the dead, and you can't know anything about religion. I was like, wow, how cool is this that God just brings this, opportunity to talk about this? So we had some conversations, and one of his objections was, well, clearly the disciples thought the tomb was empty and Jesus was gone because they moved the body back to Rome because they wanted to prove to Caesar that Jesus was dead. And so the Romans moved the body. That's why the disciples showed up. The tomb was empty. What would you say to that one?
First thing I would say to him is, why do you pick and choose scripture? When I pull scripture up, and I don't ever use a verse that only Christians use, but he might say, well, that's what Joseph, it's those gospels that are prejudiced. I think, and he has no evidence. For the first thing I'm going to say is, hey, I've listened patiently to you. I've given you 3, 4, 5 first-century sources for the burial. Why don't I just pause here for a moment and ask you to give me 3, 4, 5 first-century sources for your thesis that Jesus' body was moved to Rome? Oh, nothing? Okay, how about let's go down to 2. Can you give me 2? Oh, you can't? Okay, 1. Okay, what? You can't give me 1? I did this with a guy one time. He was not a Christian. And you know what he said to me? He said, I don't need a verse. That's my Bible logic.
Okay.
That's wonderful. I think that what that meant was, I can believe what I want to believe, which is true, but don't talk to me like you have data.
Yeah.